We're going to take an in-depth look into power plants, and we're starting right now. Thanks to all the support from patrons and channel members. It takes a while to make one of these, and your support is appreciated. Welcome to A Star Citizen's Guide to the Galaxy. What's up, citizens? This is SubliminaL here, and in this guide, I will explain my understanding of how power plants work, including power draw, max power draw, how draw request time affects your plant and your ship, how to determine if your build is power inefficient, and show you some tests that I've completed live on Twitch to find answers to some questions that I've always had about power plants. Spoiler alert, they work like coolers and you probably don't need to upgrade them, but after this video you will understand when and why you should upgrade them. The pinned comment will be used to ensure accuracy and provide a place for me to place my afterthoughts after receiving your feedback. This is part 3 in a series that covers each archetype of component and weapon in depth, so make sure you're subscribed and have the bell clicked for more. Enough with the formalities, let's get to it. I'm live on Twitch right now, so come and hang. Regardless of the testing shown here today, power plants are an important component of your ship in Star Citizen. For obvious reasons, because your ship won't turn on without one installed. PSA to new players, please note the RSI website is not a recommended source for current and updated information on ships, components, or weapons. I highly recommend Referral.games for up-to-date info that is gathered straight from the game's data. It's easy to understand how your power plant works in Star Citizen. It generates power for your components, weapons, and thrusters. Your power draw is how much power is currently being generated by your plants. To understand power draw, let's take a look at a Saber build that I made over at Referral.games. We'll be looking at the Stealth class Slipstreams. It should be noted that the Saber has 2 power plants, but I'm trying to keep this simple so the illustration will just show one. Your power draw is listed here in white. This rate is not static, it depends on a lot of things, and luckily Referral has these things toggleable. As you can see, maneuvering, shields charging, and especially firing your weapons is a huge factor in how much power your plants will need to generate, amongst other factors that don't pertain to this particular ship. If the power draw is the amount of power being generated, then you guessed it, the max power draw is the maximum amount of power the power plant can generate. This is static and only changes if you change your power plants. Only if your weapons, components, and thrusters exceed this max power draw, then you will have issues. The best way to know you have insufficient max power draw is if you see the following happening. In this demonstration, I have powered down one of the stealth power plants and it alone cannot handle the rest of this build. I'm going to simply bring my speed limiter up to max with cruise control on and start firing. Because you can't see it, I'll just let you know I'm not pulling up. What I think is happening here is some of the thrusters that are keeping me balanced are malfunctioning and causing me to drift in one direction, in this case up. When I stop firing, you can see the ship starts to head in the intended direction. Also, if you have a keen eye, you'll notice the CS series repeater's rate of fire is atrocious right now. Having insufficient power will lower the rate of fire of your energy weapons. An even more extreme example, here I overclock the weapons and other components, and one of my weapons is firing extremely slow and is no longer in sync with the others, that are still firing nowhere near the intended rate. To make sure this doesn't happen, just plug your build into Referral, and if you see this, you should make some changes before heading out into the verse. If not, you're good to go. Also, Referral does not factor in overclocking, so if you plan to do so, it's best to leave some headroom. Back to the power plants. The common misconception I've seen in the community is that buying power plants with a higher power draw will yield a faster rate of fire or have some other sort of positive effect on your ship. I'm sorry to break it to you, it doesn't. The problem is the cables, or what CIG calls pipes that lead into your components, cannot be changed by using a different power plant. The size or gauge of these pipes is determined by the component, weapon, or maybe even the ship itself. For example, if you're watching this, you probably have a pretty decent gaming PC. You may have noticed that the gauge on the cable is much greater than the one that you use to power your alarm clock, but certainly not anywhere near as big as the one that uses to power an AC unit. That's because there's a limited amount of power that can be sent through a cable. So by thinking that upgrading your power plants will raise your rate of fire or raise your DPS, you are essentially asking for the ship or the component's gauge to be widened, and that's not currently possible. This pipe system that CIG uses is how the system currently works, but there are plans to change this in the future. For now, either your power plant has sufficient enough max power draw or it doesn't. Spending money on more power than you need yields no benefit. Now let's talk about how request time affects your power plants. We'll be looking at 3 very good but very different power plants: the quick stealth class Slipstream, the all-around great JS300, and the beefy Breton. Let's look at the Slipstream first. It has a max power draw of 1788 and a request time of 1.25 seconds. What you need to understand is that from the start, the Slipstream does not generate power at a rate of 1788 per second. It's actually generating at an idle rate, if powered up. Request time is the amount of time in seconds that it takes for the power plant to get from 0 to the max rate of 1788 per second. So for our example, the Slipstream will take a little less than 1.25 seconds to reach the 1788 power per second if going from idle to its max rate, or the full 1.25 seconds from a cold start, either because you just powered up your ship or you're starting to recover from an EMP. Now let's compare this to the all-around great JS300. It has a max power draw of almost 3,700 per second and a request time of 10 seconds. Decent power draw, but not so good request time. And finally, the Breton with over 4,700 power generation per second and a 21.25 second request time. Great power draw, but terrible request time. Now let's watch all 3 of these power up at the same time. Alright, I want to show you something. Let's use the Arrow for example. If equipped with fixed Mantis GT220s, and FR66 and 2 zero rushes, it requires almost 1,500 power draw if you're maneuvering and firing while your shields are charging. Now let's start this illustration over and add the 1,500 power draw needed for reference. If this is all the power generation you need, why go with the power plant that generates so much more power? While we're waiting for the Breton to fully power up, let me talk about a common myth amongst the community. If you've seen my cooler video, you can skip ahead. If your ship can carry 2 power plants like the Sabre or Banu Defender, each power plant adds to the pool of max power draw and work independently. For example, if you pair the Slipstream with a Breton, the Breton will not inherit the lower request time of the Slipstream. This also applies to all other components. This may have been the case multiple patches ago, but not now. Now for some in-game testing to find answers to some questions I have and about rumors I've heard, mainly about rate of fire. The first test, we will show a stock fire rate with no changes to power or prioritization. You'll be seeing the first 5 seconds of size 3 CF series laser repeaters from each pair of the power plants tested. Try to listen to see if there's any difference between each plant. Alright, that's the baseline. Let's try overclocking the power plants. I didn't hear any difference between the two. Okay, so overclocking the power plant doesn't affect fire rate. Let's see if we give more power prioritization to weapons to see if it makes a difference. There's no difference to me. Now let's put all 9 of these clips together without me pausing in between each test. And I'm adding this in because someone mentioned it during my live stream. We're going to do an acceleration test. The clip is going to start at the first frame of acceleration and end at the frame at which it reaches its max speed.
Danger, engines overheating. Danger, engines overheating. Danger, engines overheating. Danger, engines overheating.
That was about 4 frames of difference. So what did we learn about this week? Well, we learned that like coolers before it, upgrading your power plants past what is needed for your build currently yields no benefit. That overclocking your power plant is only beneficial if you have insufficient power to begin with. And that the power triangle is more of a power prioritizer that is again only useful if your power plant can't handle your build. For Star Citizen's Guide to the Galaxy, I'm SubliminaL. I'll see you next week. No, don't leave. I'm just joking. I love Jared. Due to what I've learned throughout this testing and research, There are 3 options you should go with when picking power plants. First is, if your stock power plants can handle your upgrades, then there's no reason to upgrade them. If you still want to upgrade them, you have 2 options. Either go with grade 1 stealth power plants to get the lowest possible EMIR emissions, or my personal favorite, go with the lowest draw request time in case you get EMP'd. In most cases, the latter 2 are probably the same power plant, like the Slipstream. Best of both worlds. The problem is there's only a few ships and builds that can operate with just 1788 max power draw. If not, then I'd recommend the old trusty JS series. I'm recording this dialogue now and I feel like my point isn't really being made clear, and this also applies to coolers. Power plants and coolers aren't broken. They are working as intended, and like everything else in Star Citizen, there are plans for more improvements. I think the current pipe system lacks depth. The components themselves have a lot of depth with the draw rate and request time, but I feel as though the request time doesn't matter much unless you get EMP. A great example of depth is shields. Stay tuned for my full guide on those coming soon. I believe that if the community's assumptions about faster fire rate, a longer time before overheating for both weapons and thrusters were actually true, it would make ship modifications much more important. I do, however, know that this system will improve in the future, and I look forward to it. I hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look into power plants. In part 4 in this series, we'll take an in-depth look into shields. It will be added to the info card, end screen, and description once it's complete. Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoy my channel, there are 6 ways to support it. Number 1, you can smash that like button. Number 2, you can share this content with someone who may enjoy it. Number 3, you can check out my locations of Stanton collection over at Displate and in the merch store. You can follow me on Twitch. I go live after almost every release. Twitch Prime subs help support the channel. You can subscribe and turn on notifications by clicking the circle here. And number 6, if you're feeling jitters, consider becoming a channel member, or even better, a patron. Some pledge perks can be seen here, including desktop versions of my Locations of Stanton collection available to all patrons and channel members. If not, just sticking around to the end is greatly appreciated. Until next time, citizens, I'll see you in the verse.